Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So in the dead of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The Oil Rig. The Aurora oil rig, an imposing structure of steel and concrete, floated precariously in the North Atlantic's unforgiving waters. It was a colossus of modern engineering, its towering legs sunk deep into the seabed. The rig's upper platforms were a maze of machinery and walkways, crisscrossing in a complex network that seemed to reach out into the stormy sky. Eric Johansson, clad in his heavy oilskin jacket, stepped off the helicopter onto the cold metal deck of the rig. The wind was an unrelenting force, gusting with such force that it nearly knocked him off balance. The air was a harsh, briny mixture of salt and oil, the smell of which clung stubbornly to his clothes. The waves churned angrily beneath the rig, their dark, frothy peaks illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning. The rig's deck was a sprawling expanse of metal grates and railings, slick with the relentless rain. The main entrance led into the rig's core, a steel-walled corridor lined with industrial fixtures and dim, flickering lights. The corridor echoed with the deep, mechanical hum of the engines, creating a constant, almost oppressive background noise. The mess hall was a relatively large space with functional steel tables and benches. The walls were adorned with old, faded posters depicting safety procedures and company slogans, their edges curling from age. A large, grimy window offered a view of the roiling ocean outside. Inside, the hum of the rig's machinery was slightly muffled, but the air was still heavy with the smell of oil and machinery. Eric found Carl seated at a table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. Carl's weathered face bore the marks of years spent battling the harsh elements of offshore work. He looked up as Eric approached, his eyes reflecting a deep-seated unease. "Hey, Eric," Carl said, his voice rough but strained. "Glad you're here. It's been a rough few weeks." "What's going on?" Eric asked, taking a seat opposite Carl and grabbing a cup of coffee. The warmth of the coffee was a welcome relief from the chill of the outside air. Carl leaned in, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Equipment's been acting up. There've been some weird smells and shadows. No one's seen anything concrete, but everyone's on edge." Eric frowned, sensing the tension in Carl's tone. The flickering overhead lights cast long, jittery shadows that danced across the walls, heightening the sense of unease. He made a note in his log about Carl's concerns, intending to follow up on them. Later, Eric called Ingrid from his cramped cabin. The room was a stark, functional space, dominated by a narrow metal bed, a small desk, and a tiny porthole window that framed the tumultuous sea. The sound of the waves crashing against the rig's supports created a relentless, thunderous backdrop. Ingrid's voice, strained and filled with worry, crackled over the static-filled line. "Lucas had another nightmare," Ingrid said, her voice tinged with frustration. "He said he saw shadows moving in his room." Eric tried to reassure her, though his own unease made it difficult. "It's just the stress. The rig is a tough place, but it'll be okay. I'll be home before you know it." As Eric hung up, the oppressive cold of the cabin seemed to seep into his bones. He lay down on the narrow bed, the coarse blanket providing little comfort. The wind howled outside, the noise amplified by the metal structure of the rig. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the flickering lights cast distorted shadows on the walls, creating a nightmarish landscape in his dreams. The morning greeted the rig with a sullen, overcast sky. The sun was a mere hint behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting a gray pallor over everything. The wind had picked up, howling through the rig's metal frame and whipping the sea into a frothy frenzy. The waves crashed violently against the supports, their sound a constant, menacing roar. Eric's morning inspection took him to the oil tanks. The tanks, massive cylindrical structures that towered over him, were coated in grime and rust. Their surfaces were streaked with dark, oily residue. The pungent smell of crude oil was overpowering, mingling with the salty scent of the ocean. As Eric approached the tanks, he noticed something unusual. The oil within the tanks had developed an almost iridescent sheen, reflecting the dim light in eerie, shifting patterns. The surface of the oil seemed to ripple with a strange, almost sentient quality, moving in a way that defied normal physics. Eric collected a sample, the thick, black liquid moving with a peculiar rhythm that sent a shiver down his spine. Throughout the day, the rig's machinery exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. Valves hissed and creaked, gauges fluctuated wildly, and the once steady hum of the engines became a discordant cacophony of mechanical failures. The crew's anxiety was palpable, their faces drawn and tired. During the midday briefing with Anders, Eric voiced his concerns about the oil. The briefing room was a small, dimly lit space, cluttered with blueprints and machinery schematics. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. Anders, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense attitude, listened with growing impatience. "It's probably nothing," Anders said dismissively. "Oil can vary for all sorts of reasons. We've got more pressing issues. Focus on keeping the rig operational." Despite Anders' reassurances, Eric couldn't shake his growing unease. The crew's interactions were terse, their conversations clipped and guarded. The once bustling rig now felt like a claustrophobic maze, with every corner harboring an unspoken tension. The day ended with the rig cloaked in a dense fog, the visibility reduced to mere feet. The fog clung to the metal surfaces, adding to the sense of isolation and unease. Eric, lying in his small cabin, was plagued by vivid, unsettling dreams. Shadows danced across his vision, and he felt an oppressive weight on his chest, as if the very air around him was growing thicker. When he awoke, the persistent cold and dampness of the cabin seemed to amplify his discomfort. The phone line to Ingrid crackled with static, making their conversation frustratingly difficult. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, and Eric found it hard to focus on anything beyond the mounting sense of dread. By the third day, the rig's atmosphere had become increasingly oppressive. The overcast sky remained unchanged, a constant shroud of gray that pressed down on the rig. The wind howled with a relentless fury, sending waves crashing violently against the supports. The rain fell in torrential sheets, battering the rig's metal surfaces with a ceaseless drumming noise. The crew's behavior had become increasingly erratic. During a routine equipment check, Tom, a young technician known for his reliability, approached Eric with a visibly distressed expression. "I saw something," Tom said, his voice trembling. "It was dark and shifting, like shadows coming to life." Eric listened with growing concern. The rig's environment seemed to be taking a toll on everyone's mental state. The oil's behavior had become more erratic, with its surface exhibiting a strange, pulsating glow that seemed to sync with the crew's emotional states. One evening, while inspecting the oil tanks, Eric noticed that the sheen on the oil had intensified. It seemed to pulsate with an almost rhythmic quality, as if it was reacting to something beyond mere physical factors. Eric took another sample, but the unsettling feeling persisted. The oil's surface seemed to ripple with a life of its own, reacting to his presence. In the mess hall, Eric sat with Carl and Anna, who appeared visibly shaken. Carl, usually a stoic figure, spoke in hushed tones. "I've been seeing things, shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. It's happening more often and it's getting worse." Anna, her face pale, nodded in agreement. I've heard similar things from others. Some guys are talking about strange noises and feeling watched. As Eric listened, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around him. The rain lashed against the windows, creating a relentless, drumming rhythm that matched the pounding in his head. The rig's lights flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. Eric's attempts to address the issues with Anders were met with increasing hostility. The crew's psychological strain was evident in their erratic behavior and heightened paranoia. The once familiar routine of the rig had become a nightmarish ordeal, with every minor issue exacerbated by the growing sense of dread. On the fourth day, the rig was engulfed by an even more intense storm. The wind howled with a ferocity that seemed almost alive, and the rain fell in relentless sheets. The ocean was a churning, turbulent mass, with waves crashing against the rig's supports with a violent, almost vengeful energy. Crew members reported increasingly vivid and disturbing hallucinations. During a late morning meeting, Eric observed that Tom, now visibly agitated, was claiming to have seen shadowy figures moving about the rig. His claims were dismissed by Anders, but the unsettling nature of Tom's experience added to the growing tension among the crew. Eric decided to investigate the control room's malfunctioning equipment. The control room was a labyrinth of blinking lights and whirring machines, with a constant hum of machinery providing a backdrop to the growing sense of unease. The once familiar gauges and monitors now seemed to display erratic readings, their displays flickering with a strange, otherworldly light. As Eric attempted to recalibrate the controls, he was interrupted by a sudden, inexplicable shift in the oil's behavior. The substance seemed to writhe and twist, as if it were a living entity trying to break free from its confines. The surface of the oil bubbled and churned, reacting violently to Eric's presence. In the midst of his efforts to stabilize the equipment, Eric felt a sudden, sharp pain in his head. The room seemed to spin, and he experienced a disorienting sense of detachment. The shadows in the control room twisted and lengthened, creating an eerie, nightmarish landscape. Eric fought to regain his bearings, struggling against the growing sense of panic. Carl, who had been working nearby, approached Eric with a worried expression. "Are you okay? You look pale." Eric tried to reassure Carl, but the growing sense of dread was difficult to shake. The oil's strange behavior seemed to be linked to the crew's psychological state, and Eric's attempts to address the issue were increasingly hampered by the rig's deteriorating environment. The evening brought with it a sense of foreboding. The storm outside had intensified, with the wind howling like a living entity. The rain battered the rig with a relentless fury, and the ocean roared beneath the structure. The atmosphere on the rig was suffused with an oppressive sense of dread, and the crew's behavior became increasingly erratic. As the days progressed, the rig's situation continued to deteriorate. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the wind howled through the metal framework of the rig. The ocean was a roiling tempest, with waves crashing against the structure with a force that seemed almost deliberate. The crew's behavior became more erratic, with arguments breaking out over trivial matters. Some crew members exhibited bizarre behavior, claiming to see shadowy figures and hear disembodied voices. Eric observed that the oil's surface continued to exhibit strange, almost sentient qualities, reacting to the crew's heightened states of fear and anxiety. Laura Hastings, the investigative journalist, began her investigation from the mainland. Her initial contact with Eric was fraught with urgency. Eric described the increasingly bizarre phenomena, and Laura, intrigued and alarmed, began to piece together the puzzle. Laura's research revealed a history of similar occurrences in offshore environments. She interviewed former rig workers and experts, uncovering a pattern of strange events and unexplained phenomena. The reports of hallucinations and mechanical failures pointed to a possible connection with the oil, suggesting that it might harbor some form of parasitic or alien life. Meanwhile, Eric continued to battle the mounting crisis on the rig. The crew's behavior became increasingly unpredictable, and the oil's influence over them grew stronger. Eric's attempts to contain the situation were hampered by the deteriorating conditions and the growing sense of dread. The rig's environment became increasingly hostile. The incessant rain, howling wind, and crashing waves created a relentless assault on the senses. The once familiar machinery now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its movements jerky and unpredictable. Eric, struggling to maintain control, found himself in a nightmarish maze of malfunctioning equipment and distorted reality. The oil's influence over the rig's systems made it difficult to implement effective containment measures. The shadows on the rig seemed to come alive, twisting and contorting in a grotesque dance. By the seventh day, the rig had descended into a state of chaos. The once sturdy structure was now a twisted labyrinth of malfunctioning equipment and warped metal. The oil, now a living, pulsating mass, had seeped into every crevice, creating a nightmarish landscape. The control room, once a hub of activity, was now a surreal environment. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting and distorting with each passing moment. The air was thick with a strange, almost palpable tension, and the oil's pulsating glow illuminated the room with an eerie, unsettling light. Eric, now physically and mentally exhausted, fought to maintain control. The oil seemed to have a will of its own, manipulating the environment and influencing the crew. Shadows twisted and writhed, their forms taking on nightmarish shapes that seemed to come alive with each flicker of the lights. In a terrifying moment of realization, Eric encountered the entity within the oil. It was a grotesque, shifting mass of dark, bioluminescent tendrils that seemed to writhe and pulse with an otherworldly energy. The entity's presence was a profound, palpable force that seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. The entity's influence over the rig became more pronounced. Machinery malfunctioned with increasing frequency, and the oil's pulsations became more erratic. Eric's attempts to isolate and neutralize the entity were met with increasing resistance. The oil seemed to respond to his efforts with violent, almost vengeful reactions. Eric found himself in a harrowing chase through the rig's labyrinthine corridors. The once familiar paths now seemed alien and twisted, the shadows elongating and distorting in a grotesque dance. The entity's presence created a nightmarish landscape of shifting shadows and disorienting reflections. In one particularly suspenseful moment, Eric was forced to navigate through a maze of malfunctioning equipment. Sparks flew from exposed wires, and the metal floor was slick with oil. Eric had to use all his ingenuity to avoid the hazards and find a way to reach the rig's central control panel. As he fought to regain control, the rig's environment seemed to close in around him. The machinery groaned and shuddered, the metal buckling under the strain. Eric's efforts to contain the entity were hampered by the ever-present sense of dread and the growing influence of the oil. The final confrontation with the entity was a harrowing ordeal. The rig's environment had become a twisted, nightmarish landscape. The machinery, once reliable and sturdy, was now a grotesque parody of its former self. Pipes and cables twisted and writhed, their forms distorted by the entity's influence. Eric fought to isolate and destroy the entity, using every resource at his disposal. The oil's pulsating glow illuminated the rig with an eerie light, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to come alive with each passing moment. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning oil and the strange metallic scent that had become a constant presence. The rig's structure groaned under the strain, the metal creaking and bending as the entity's influence intensified. Eric's struggle was both physical and psychological, as the entity's presence eroded his sanity. The once familiar environment had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows and distorted reality. In one particularly tense moment, Eric was trapped in the rig's central control room, the machinery malfunctioning and the oil's influence creating a nightmarish landscape. The entity seemed to be toying with him, manipulating the environment to create a series of harrowing obstacles. Eric had to use his knowledge of the rig's systems to navigate through the increasingly bizarre and dangerous environment. The oil's pulsations created a rhythmic pattern that Eric had to decipher in order to find a way to neutralize the entity. Laura Hastings, working remotely, coordinated with experts and emergency response teams. Her insights, though limited by distance, were crucial in helping Eric formulate a plan. The reports of similar occurrences in other offshore environments suggested that the entity's influence might be more widespread than previously thought. In a final, desperate attempt, Eric managed to isolate the entity and neutralize its influence. The rig's structure groaned and shuddered, the metal buckling under the strain. The oil began to recede, its pulsating glow fading as the entity's influence waned. Eric, battered and exhausted, finally managed to regain some semblance of control. The once nightmarish landscape began to return to normal, though the damage was extensive. The rig lay in ruins, a twisted wreck scarred by the violent encounter with the entity. When the cleanup crew arrived, they found evidence of the entity, but no clear explanation for the events that had transpired. The rig was a twisted wreck, its metal framework scarred and battered by the encounter. The oil, once a living, pulsating mass, had receded, leaving behind a dark, oily residue. Eric was rescued and taken back to the mainland. The transition back to normal life was jarring, and Eric struggled to reintegrate into his family life. The horrors of the rig had left deep scars, both physical and psychological. Ingrid and the children welcomed Eric with open arms, but the emotional distance between them was palpable. Eric's attempts to reconnect with his family were hindered by the psychological scars of his ordeal. The sense of isolation and dread that had pervaded the rig now colored his interactions with his loved ones. Laura Hastings, despite the limited information available, published an investigative report on the incident. Her article highlighted the unexplained phenomena and the potential dangers of working with unknown substances. The report raised awareness about the risks associated with offshore drilling and the need for better safety protocols. Laura's investigation revealed a pattern of similar occurrences in other offshore environments. The entity's influence, though elusive and poorly understood, suggested that the risks associated with such environments were greater than previously thought. As the days passed, Eric struggled to come to terms with his experience. The nightmares and hallucinations that had plagued him during his time on the rig continued to haunt him. The sense of dread and isolation lingered, casting a shadow over his daily life. Ingrid attempted to support Eric, but the emotional strain of the ordeal created a rift between them. Eric's attempts to communicate his experiences were met with frustration and disbelief. The psychological scars of his time on the rig were difficult to reconcile with his family life. Laura Hastings continued her investigation, interviewing experts and former rig workers. Her findings raised important questions about the risks associated with offshore drilling and the need for better safety measures. The report became a focal point for discussions about the future of offshore oil extraction. The Aurora oil rig remained a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the remote and unforgiving environments of the deep ocean. The entity's influence had left a lasting mark on those who had encountered it, and the secrets of the abyss remained hidden, waiting for the next unwitting soul to uncover them. The story of the Aurora oil rig became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the unknown dangers that lie beneath the surface of the ocean. The entity's influence had revealed a dark and terrifying truth, and the experience had left an indelible mark on those who had faced its horrors. Eric Johansson's ordeal was a testament to the fragility of human sanity in the face of the unknown. The abyssal depths had revealed something profoundly terrifying, and the encounter with the entity had changed him forever. The secrets of the deep ocean remained hidden, waiting for the next explorer to uncover their dark and terrifying truth.